Namaskar. Welcome to your own channel Saptarisi Astro Sutra. Today we are having the first astrological session with the legend Sri Marc Boney ji. And we request you all to kindly open your chart and also have the chart of any known astrologer in your lineage or in your friends, and Sir will give out the research on how to see how the yogas are made for astrologers, when a person will teach astrology, learn astrology, or think about astrology, or when they will come into astrology. So the stage is given to the sir, and let's hear from him and see how the things unfold. Welcome, sir. Namaste.
Namaste. Well, first of all, we have to understand that involvement in astrology can show up in so many ways in a birth chart, all right? But because I would often get the question from people, can I do astrology? Do I have the capacity to learn Jyotish? Very frequent question, as Sandeep probably is aware, right? Um, First of all, can I learn Jyotish? Well, anyone with a reasonably good intellect who applies themselves can learn the basics of Jyotish, right? I mean, regardless of whether they have the combinations in their chart to be, a Jyotishi itself, right? So, I don't want to discourage anyone because I think anyone can benefit from learning Jyotish. And again, if you have a reasonable intelligence and you apply yourself and you can find a good teacher, then you can learn Jyotish. Now, it's a different thing where a chart shows someone who has a really good capacity to do Jyotish and maybe has even got the karmic destiny to be deeply involved in Jyotish, right? So the way I'm going to first address this question, well, I can share screen, right? So soon you should be seeing a document where it says Stargazers, yes? So I got this question so often, so now I know that I wrote this article called Stargazers, the Birth Charts of Astrologers. And what I did in that article is to quote from a book by KNRao, in which, in fact, one of my favorite books of his called Yogi's Destiny and the Wheel of Time, where he recounts all his encounters with very high developed spiritual souls, gurus, sadhus, and so forth. And of course, every teacher has had their teacher. And one of his teachers was a man that he referred to as Yogi Bhaskaranandaji. And Yogi Bhaskaranandaji had given KNRao some of what he liked to see in a chart for a person doing Jyotish. And so this is what I'm going to share with you. So the first thing, both for spirituality and astrology, he liked to see Ketu in the esoteric houses, which would be 4, 8, and 12, but with the additional influence of natural benefics, particularly the influence of either Jupiter or Mercury, or alternatively, with the influence of the 5th or the 9th lords, right? Because this is the thing that spiritualizes Ketu. Ketu, of course, can be a mokshakaraka, but it's not a mokshakaraka in everyone's chart, right? If it's under certain conditions, then it inclines a person towards spiritual life, and it inclines them towards, pursuing moksha. So, but just for astrology, in general, a strong Jupiter, a strong Mercury is something that it can be very conducive towards learning and being involved in Jyotish. These are the two planets of astrology. Sandeep, with your permission, I may show your chart later, in which case we'll see in Sandeep's chart that he has both Jupiter in its exaltation sign and Mercury in its exaltation sign, right? So these factors alone can be supportive that way, right? And then in terms of placement, he thought Mercury in the 4th house was best. Second best was the 8th. I like to see this because my Mercury's in the 8th. And the third best is in the 10th house. But in general, he liked to see Mercury in the angles. Now, again, if you've got a chart where these factors don't exist, doesn't mean you can't learn Jyotish or can't be involved in Jyotish. So don't take that away. I'm just saying that these were things that he liked to see, and these are the things that I've seen in the charts of people who are deeply involved in doing Jyotish. Best was Jupiter in the 10th without affliction, Um, why? Because it aspects onto the second house of speech. So regardless of whether your Jupiter's in the 10th, if the second house has the influence of Jupiter, why would that be beneficial? Well, the second house of speech is what you say, right? And if you have the influence of strong natural benefics, what you say may come true, meaning it
Yes,
can
sir.
be conducive for making accurate predictions, right? Um, so Jupiter unafflicted in the 10th, and of course you've seen KNRao's horoscope in Libra Lagna. He has Jupiter, an exalted Jupiter in the 10th house without affliction. It aspects onto the second house. He predicted fantastically, right? Now this is an interesting one. Look at that next point here. Saturn in the third, the ninth, I'm sorry, the fifth or the ninth can bring about a detached, unbiased view on matters, but only when it's not blemished, and better if it gets the additional influence of a natural benefic. For Lagnas, he liked Mercury ruled Rashis. Suraj, of course, you are Virgo Lagna, Mercury ruled Lagna, right?
Yes, sir.
As well as the intellectual signs, Libra and Aquarius. But he would say that any Lagna can be good as long as the four planets that were outlined earlier are well placed, right? So these are the things that he'd like to see. But I want to emphasize again is that if these don't exist in a chart, in your chart, doesn't mean, again, you're not necessarily going to be able to learn Jyotish or do Jyotish. These are just, you might say, a subset of factors that he liked to see and which are good that way, all right? So I'll start out by just showing you the chart of B.V. Raman, right? Obviously, legendary astrologer, was kind of the ambassador, the first ambassador for Vedic astrology around the world. He traveled the world doing presentations on this, even addressed the United Nations in New York at one point, right? So, and of course, authored many books. I would think he's maybe sort of one of the most legendary astrologers of the last century. So, what do we see here? Well, focus in on Mercury and Jupiter first. Both of them are in angles, right? Do you see any source of strength for Mercury? Well, you should see that it's 1357 will be Vargotama, right? And now, where's K2? K2 is in the esoteric eighth house, giving the results of who? Giving the results of Mercury. So, just some of the brief things that I mentioned, I'm highlighting here. Now, it was his destiny. He learned Jyotish from his grandfather, who was also quite a notable Jyotishi himself. His grandfather, I can't pull the chart up, but he had Scorpio Lagna, he had Mercury Jupiter in the 10th. So you see how that also applied to the chart of his rather renowned grandfather. So another example here, I'll just, well, actually, I do have the chart of his. Actually, this is not his chart anyway. So now KNRao, right? So exalted Jupiter, exalted Mercury, sees Saturn in the third. Remember, for this idea of having take a detached point of view, and it's unafflicted. And of course, K2 is where? It's in the 12th, in the esoteric moksha house with the 12th Lord itself. No wonder he liked these parameters because they all applied to his chart, right?
Great.
Um, so, and then, there's combinations here, obviously, for, great professional success. Both, he became an accountant general in the audits, accounts and audits area of the Indian civil service, right? And then, of course, became, a legendary Jyotishi. By the way, he was kind of just sort of laboring, as he said, in obscurity for a long time. He started writing articles for B.V. Raman's Astrological magazine. That's how he got to be known a little bit. But when, he retired from the civil service, he got approached by the Bharatiya Vidya Bhavan to start an Institute of Astrology there, which, of course, has become the biggest, in some ways, most prestigious astrological school in the world. But, when did he start then coming to the U.S.? When he got invited to be the chief guest at the Second International Symposium of Vedic Astrology by David Frawley. When did this take place? In Mercury Sun, period and sub-period of two planets in the 12th house. And of course, a lot of what he authored was in the Mercury major period. Of course, Mercury is one of the two grahas of authorship and so on. So, you see how his karma unfolded that way. All right. So another well-known Jyotishi, Sanjay Rath, who I don't always agree with with regards to how we do Jaimini, but viva la difference, you might say. But what do we see here? Of course, you see Jupiter right there in the Lagna giving Hamsa Yoga. It's also the 10th Lord. And then Mercury, 1322 of Leo, is Vargotama, right? And it was actually in his Mercury major period that he kind of burst upon the Jyotish scene and became a prominent teacher, author, so on and so forth. A lot of his initial books were written in the Mercury major period, another graha having to do with. So we see these factors here. Deepak Basaria is one of KNRao's, right-hand man, you might say. He was one of his faculty. He was the editor of his journal for a long time. And really, the primary factor that we really see here is, Mercury. Remember, they talked about Mercury in the fourth house, of course, in which it would then aspect onto the 10th house. So these are some of the factors you can see here. Someone may recognize the name Arsathanam, right? Arsathanam is someone who did one of the monumental sort of translation work, translated the both volumes of the Brihat Parashara Shastra, right? Now, here we see a strong Mercury, a strong Jupiter in particular, in combination with Rahu and Mars in the ninth house. Now, these had some other, significations, but when I have this mentorship program, right, and it's a program you have to apply to. I don't accept everyone, and of course, one of the things I'm looking at is the person's birth chart, and the two first things that I always look at is the Mercury and Jupiter. What's happening with Mercury and Jupiter, right? For example, in your chart, Suraj, you have Mercury as the Lagna Lord. It goes to the fifth, right? It's with the fifth Lord, shows really good intellectual capacity, right? It's part of a Buddha Ditya Yoga. It's with the Sun. So, these are the kind of things that I would see, but I'm going to pull your chart up in a minute because we have to look at it in a different way. All right. So, David Frawley, some may recognize the term, right? He's actually quite a Vedic scholar. In not just Jyotish, but yoga and Ayurveda and just the Sanatana Dharma in general. But he wrote a book called Astrology of the Seers that became quite popular amongst the English-speaking population here in the U.S. Now, we all know that yoga, you talked about yoga, a yoga that would be conducive towards any kind of learning, particularly learning of classical subjects, would be what? Saraswati yoga. And, in the definition of Saraswati Yoga, B.V. Raman and KNRao always included the 11th house. So when natural benefics fall in angle and trine houses or 2 and 11, this can give a good Saraswati Yoga. You can see that all these benefics are connected in his chart along the 511 axes, right? And he's authored so many things, fifth house being, particularly the house of book authorship. Now, I've noticed that in people who get involved in Jyotish, if they then run either Jupiter-Mercury or Mercury-Jupiter periods, then this is a time quite significant in their involvement in Jyotish. And in his case, he wrote his book, The Astrology of the Seers, right in his Jupiter major period Mercury sub-period, right? And you see K2 here again in the 12th house, right? Moksha house. So a lot of the parameters that are talked about here existed in his chart. So Dennis Harness, also another very, very prominent American Jyotishi for years and years and years, 2 decades. He was the organizer for major astrological conferences, right? Authored a good book on nakshatras. Dennis's chart is quite unique and interesting in a lot of different ways. First of all, Sandeep should recognize these placements of Jupiter and Mercury, right? We've got Jupiter in its exaltation sign, Mercury They form a beautiful hemming of the benefit of the Lagna. And think about this combination in the first house. We've got Yogacark and ninth Lord Mars, 10th Lord Venus, Lagna Lord Sun. Right? Now that's a Raja Yoga. Right? And of course, it benefits from then also the benefic hemming. He became this very prominent figure in Jyotish in the U.S. in his Sun major period, not surprising. And of course, was in leadership positions. There was KNRao helped them found the American College of Vedic Astrology, of which he was, the president for a long time. And so you see those yogas, Raja yogas, put him in leadership positions. But you can see also the way in which his chart is very conducive. Saturn exalted in the third. Remember this idea? Without additional malefic
Yes, sir.
influence. Right? So, I could go on and on here. These are, well-known Jyotishis. Simon Tchaikovsky, you might recognize his name, has really made a name for himself in terms of particularly looking at comparing two charts in terms of relationship compatibility. Quite a Sanskrit scholar, favorite of mine, like him a lot, and we've been at conferences together. We always enjoy his company. But what do we see here? Strong Jupiter. Now, who's the esoteric house that's most related to Jyotish, that's most related to the occult sciences? Of course, it's the eighth house.
Eight.
Right? So here he has and it's interesting, he has this Chandramangala Yoga here in the eighth house because he, you might say, is a little bit of a Jyotish rebel in certain ways, but in a good way. He wrote a book called the Dharma of Gambling, about using Jyotish in order to make bets and earn money that way. But anyway, when did he learn Jyotish? He learned Jyotish from a man named Hart Defoe, a very prominent Canadian Jyotishi. And he learned that in the Jupiter major period. But the combination I really like in his chart is where you've got the Mercury-Saturn combination, right? Saturn, Yogacaraka, 9th and 10th Lord in a mutual aspect with Mercury, the second and fifth Lord, right? And it was in the Saturn major period that he's come to prominence here as a Jyotish. Look at the strength of Mercury in an exchange with Mars. So we always should understand that whenever a planet is involved in an exchange, this is a source of strength for a planet, gives its results as if it's almost like in its own sign. So, but I want to stop share screen, pull up my program, and because, these combinations don't just exist in famous Jyotishis, right? They also exist in the charts of people who get deeply immersed in Jyotish and become quite proficient at it. So I'm going to pull up my program. You can let me know. And you asked about the timing of when people get involved in Jyotish. And again, this can show up in so many different ways. You should be seeing the chart now.
Yes, sir.
Right?
Yes.
This is the chart of a very famous Jyotishi, Sandeep Tyagi. So we see here what I mentioned earlier. First of all, Jupiter in its exaltation sign, Mercury as the 10th Lord in the 10th in its exaltation sign. And in this case, for Sagittarius, when the Lagna Lord goes to the 8th, right, this alone can give a very, very strong interest in all esoteric subjects, including Jyotish. And you can see that Sandeep has his Jupiter in its exaltation start going to the 8th. But then timing. My understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, Sandeep, it was in your Venus major period. This was when you've been gotten deeply immersed in Jyotish. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Yeah.
Right at the beginning of Venus Dasha.
Right. So this is where, I've really emphasized with my students, when we interpret what results a major period Lord can give, we have to see it from three perspectives. Of course, where it falls and what it rules from the birth Lagna, but then very importantly also from Chandra Lagna, using the position of the moon as if it's the first house, right? So when we see using Aquarius as a Lagna, where does Venus fall?
8th house.
In the 8th house with the 8th Lord Mercury, planet of astrology, right? In fact, there's a rather complex configuration going on there. These planets also get the aspect of Saturn from the 4th. So it was in his, you could have thought this could have happened in the Mercury major period, but actually what it did is it started in the Venus major period with all these planets, including Venus, falling in the eighth house from the moon with the eighth lord. But the chart I want to bring up here to discuss. Now, I'll go back to those parameters, those predictive parameters that Yogi Bhaskaranandaji shared with KNRao, and think about how they apply to this chart here. First of all, we like to see Jupiter and Mercury in the angles, and in particular, Jupiter in the 10th. So here we have Scorpio Lagna with Jupiter and Mercury in the 10th house. You like to see Saturn in the 3rd house. Here, Saturn is both the 3rd lord in the 3rd house, doesn't have any malefic influence, only has benefic influence, aspect of Venus. And then the first thing he mentioned, both for astrology and spirituality, he'd like to see Ketu in the esoteric houses 4, 8, and 12. So this is Ketu in the 8th house. Now, you also like to see it additionally under the influence of natural benefics, and especially either Mercury or Jupiter. Of course, K2 is in Mercury's sign here, but then do you see how K2 actually does come under the influence of also Jupiter more in a subtle way? And I'll just highlight that here. K2 is in the nakshatra of Jupiter, while Jupiter at 811 of Leo is in the nakshatra of Ketu. So this brings about what's called a sukshma parivartana yoga, a subtle exchange, but it is a way in which planets do get strongly connected. So you do have to see this Jupiter as also, Ketu is under the strong influence of Jupiter as well. And then it's not just a combination of Jupiter and Mercury in the 10th house, but Mercury actually rules the 8th house of the occult sciences. And then you can see that since age 18, this person has been running the Jupiter major period. And this is when their interest in astrology got sparked. And now there's someone that has been studying with me for a number of years, very, very proficient at both the Parashari system and the Jaimini system, predicts very well. I suspect at some point here, not too far, they'll start teaching themselves. They consult, so you can see how this chart actually meets every parameter that was mentioned by Yogi Bhaskaranandaji and what KNRao quotes in his book, Yogi's Destiny and the Wheel of Time. So I mentioned that when someone applies to study with me individually in what I call my mentorship program, of course, one of the things I'm looking at is their birth chart. This was such a person, and I was quite interested and rather amazed that all the things that I typically look for were present in this birth chart. So I don't know how much do we want to how many examples do we want to see here? How many things we want to discuss? Again, it can show up in a number of different ways. And I just realized, Suraj, that I want, if you don't mind, can I display your chart?
Yes, sir.
Okay, because I want to again make some points about that, especially again with regards to timing. As I mentioned, one of the things that I liked to see about this chart, really for a really good capacity to learn any subject, would be the fact that Mercury as the Lagna Lord goes to the 5th with the 5th Lord. One of the words used for the 5th house in Prashahora is vidya, or knowledge. And of course, Mercury represents buddhi, represents the intellect. And this is also Buddhaditya Yoga, the Sun-Mercury combination, when Mercury or the Sun either rule the 1st or the 5th house, or when they're placed in the 1st and the 5th house. So this is a distinguishing feature of this horoscope that's not just, sort of conducive towards Jyotish, but towards, learning any subject. But if you look down at the Dasha sequence, you'll see that he's been running the Moon major period. And what should strike us, of course, about the moon is that it falls in the eighth house of the esoteric sciences, including Jyotish. Of course, gets the aspect of Jupiter. And by the way, KNRao employed a principle that might seem somewhat controversial to some, but he always taught that when a planet is retrograde like this Jupiter, it should be seen as being also aspecting from the previous sign. So if you take Jupiter not just aspecting from Leo, but also Cancer, then this combination in the fifth house, including Mercury, get the influence of this Jupiter as well. So then you have a Mercury-Jupiter combination, always good for Jyotish. Now, you'll notice that the current sub-period that he's running is the Mars major period, which is of our Gautama eighth lord. So period and sub-period of two grahas that are connected to his eighth house. And, I don't know much about his background other than the fact that, he's a Jyotishi and does a podcast. So he's deeply immersed in this subject, and you can see how this could be happening at this time, given the activation of eighth house factors. But I mentioned previously that, of course, when we interpret a birth chart, we must also see it from Chandra Lagna. So, and in this case, since he's running the moon period, this would also be Dasha Lagna, which we also interpret periods from, in which case this combination of the Sun, Mercury, and Saturn go to the 10th house. This would put Mercury in the 10th, right? Jupiter would actually go to the 5th from there. And think about this. By the way, someone who is doing presentations with podcasts and so forth, this is a third house indication. And 310 combinations can make you something of, someone who's very involved in these activities, even sort of professionally. So see, from the moon, Mercury becomes the third lord in the 10th with the 10th lord. And this combination of the Sun and Saturn becomes a 10-5 combination. So he would indicate that he was having some success this way. So again, I don't know how much we want to go into this, but I can show any number of examples.
It was bang on, sir.
Yes, well, this is an expression I learned from Indians. This expression, bang on. I'd never heard this before, right? We would say very correct or right on, but with Indians, it's bang on,